Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, both here in the hall and out there in the ether. Welcome back to this lovely series of Rhind Lectures presented by Professor Theresa Singleton. And yesterday and on Friday, we spent some time considering the Galagici people of Georgia. And Butler Island is in Mackintosh County. And I thought, Mackintosh, that's a Scottish name. And it's actually named after Lachlan Mackintosh of Badenoch. And in fact, the main town in Mackintosh County, Darien, used to be called New Inverness. And it was founded in 1736 by Highland Scots, encouraged there by General James Oglethorpe of Banff. So there you go. So we are more closely linked to you than we had thought. And also, you've kept it very quiet. You excavated at Grimes Graves, flint mine in East Anglia. Yeah? So we're closely linked. So now we're going to take a serendipitous turn to Cuban slavery. So over to you, Theresa.
I should have called this serendipitous turn to Caribbean slavery because my introduction to the Caribbean or Caribbean archaeology in general was in Montserrat, which has also had a strong, well, certainly has a strong UK connection and specifically Irish. But I actually, why I call that serendipity, this is like the only project or only thing I've ever done that I was able to get an opportunity to do archaeology and not have to do anything for it. This was when I was at the Smithsonian in 1990. I had landed my what I thought would be my dream job as curator of historical archaeology, and I've had that position at that time for about 2 years. And I was sitting in my office and got this desperate phone call from an archaeologist saying, Theresa, you've got to come to Montserrat, because they had planned this investigation with the Smithsonian to take volunteers, but apparently no curatorial or research staff at the Smithsonian was involved in it. And so the council or someone at the Smithsonian said, well, you can't do this without a research person as part of the project. And so they called me and say, well, we're going to be there for 2 weeks in August. I think, late July, August. Are you available? And they're very apologetic. And I was wondering, why are they being so apologetic? I don't have to do anything. They're going to pay all my expenses. This was like a really great opportunity. So anyway, I went there for 2 weeks to work with them on a project, Galway's Plantation, that the Smithsonian was interested because, and the museum I was working at the Smithsonian, because we were doing a exhibit for 1992 that highlighted what Colombian encounters, I guess. And so one of the things was, one of the vignettes of the exhibit was to recreate this slave village that was derived from the work at Montserrat. And so that's how I got introduced to Caribbean archaeology and specifically looking at slave sites and plantations on that trip. And I had hoped to do, I was hoping from that I'd get involved in another or developed a project in the English-speaking Caribbean, but that didn't happen. All my efforts on that line fell through. But I did ultimately go to Cuba. I had actually 2 opportunities to do that at the Smithsonian. The first one I was unable to. The second one developed with a colleague who was also at the Smithsonian, but he was a folklorist and ethnographer. And so the initial project was to really do an ethno-archaeological study of Afro-Cuban religions. He had collected a lot of ethnography, but he wanted to do more of a historical, looking through time, how certain cultural practices develop, and particularly, how is material culture used, and the idea was to locate some of the house temples where a lot of these practices, where they, generated from, and that was the problem, is that trying to do the archaeology got really complicated, and he had no idea how complicated archaeology could get with trying to negotiate all these things with the Cubans. So the project sort of pretty much fell apart, and so I thought that was going to be it in terms of my Cuban experience. And then my Cuban colleague said, well, isn't your area slavery? Why are you looking at this Afro-Cuban religion stuff when your area is plantations and slavery? And they said right now no one's really doing much on that. There had been work done earlier. And so they encouraged me to stay and focus on a plantation site. And we went on a couple of excavations, not excavations, but looked at a couple of expeditions, I'd say, to look at potential sites. And we founded one that I was just totally fascinated by, and so that's how that came about. But first I wanted to just whenever I talk about Cuba, particularly in the United States, I always have to give some background history, because most Americans say, well, Cuba has a history beyond Castro. It's like Fidel Castro, it's like they don't have any sense of a pre-existing, at least for lay audience, or not just lay audiences, but people who are not familiar with Caribbean history or Spanish colonial history. But Columbus did land there in 1492, but the settlement began in 1511, so this would have been after the settlement of Hispaniola, and actually it was some of the Spaniards at Hispaniola that was involved in developing settlements in Cuba. Cuba wasn't always a slave society. It didn't really become a slave society until the 19th century. Up until that time, it was really had one of the smallest slave populations in the Caribbean. So while the English and the French were building their colonies in the Caribbean and producing sugar, Cuba really wasn't involved in that in the 18th century. Things, in the 17th and 18th century, things did start changing near the end of the 18th century, but it was really not until after 1800 that they really become more and more a slaveholding society, and ultimately became the largest slaveholding society in the Spanish Empire. So at least, some people say at least 1 million enslaved people disembarked in Cuba, but I believe the most recent work from the studies of transatlantic slavery that have the database where they've counted based on records, they estimate 780,000 between 1790 and 1866. There were, of course, some enslaved people in Cuba prior to that time. And it was strongly geared toward the procurement of men. So 2/3 of the slave population was largely men. And slavery ends not until, or the slave trade ends in 1866, so that's way after the abolition of slavery almost everywhere else except Brazil. Well, the slave trade actually in Brazil ended earlier, but slavery wasn't abolished until 1886, and then Brazil, it was in 1889. And then Cuba was a Spanish colony until 1898. So the area I worked in Cuba, as I'm sure you're all aware, it's the largest of the Caribbean islands. And so I worked, and it's also very different. I mean, it's very diverse from the West and the East, and I've actually not spent any time in the East. I've spent mostly in Western Cuba, and I made a couple of trips to Central Cuba. But the project was based about 70 kilometers where you see the star, Biajacas. That was where the plantation is located. So it wasn't that far from the city of Havana, and the project team and my institutional affiliation was with the Department of Archaeology in Havana. And, normally it would be, well, I guess if there was better infrastructure, it would be a very short commute. But actually, it took like, I guess, maybe 3 hours at least to get there. Because once you drove as far as you could on paved roads, and then it was a very scenic drive, the last 15, 20 kilometers, but it was all on a dirt road that was, in bad weather, or if after the rainy season, it was difficult to even drive on the road. And I always felt like I was going from the 20th century when I started this project back into the 19th once we actually got to the site, because people still live in thatch roof housing without any indoor plumbing. And then there are few, in terms of the agriculture, there were these old, I think they got surplus from Russia, these very old tractors the farmers had access to. But a lot of but they were still relying on oxen to pull plows and that sort of thing. So it really did seem like you were moving back in time in terms of how many of the people were living. So the site that fascinated me, its official name was Santa Ana de Biajacas, and it's what fascinated me is this what you see on the screen, this tall masonry wall that surrounded the slave settlement. And that's why the book I wrote on this is called Slavery Behind the Wall, because someone asked me just not long, when I was actually in the Dominican Republic a few weeks ago, they said, behind what wall? Because they were wondering why, and I had to explain to them that the wall referred to this masonry wall that was around the slave settlement for a coffee plantation. And the wall is, 3.35 meters high. It's almost 0.70 meters thick. In terms of area, it's 6,862 meters square. So I have on here, because I'm usually talking to Americans, 1.7 acres in, the area that's actually enclosed. And the plantation was owned by Catholic priests who actually is a surname. His grandfather was Irish, the Ofarios. And this was one of 3 plantations he owned. He owned 2 sugar plantations, and then the coffee plantation was really the place, at least in his various, it was really the place that he really seemed to have liked. And he actually, in one of the documents where he had to, had some of his financial dealings, he said, I own my coffee plantation, Biajacas, free and clear. So he still owned money, or he borrowed against the sugar plantations, so he still was in debt with those, but he owned his coffee plantation free and clear. And he was from a very wealthy family. A traveler to Cuba in the 19th century referred to the Ofarios as one of the 10 most wealthy and influential families in Cuba at that time. We don't really know when the plantation started, but it was a done deal, or a lot of mishaps after his death by 1846. It was about 1,000 acres, and it had 102 enslaved laborers, and then in 1838, when he dies, they were down to 77. And the only year we have information on how much coffee produced was in 1822, and it was 105,000 pounds. One thing I should point out, unlike Butler Island, where there was always documentation, what I found difficult working in Cuba, or particularly the first half of the 19th century, is that a lot of these, there are no personal planner records. These are all public records that are in the National Archives there, where I got this information. So it's not like, so there's no correspondence, there are no diaries, no day books, the sort of thing where you could get information on the daily operation of the plantation. So these are all documents that, a lot of these were after his, it took 13 years for his estate to be settled, so a lot of these documents are really after the time that he was there. The document in 1822 that I found was like a godsend. It had all this information. It was sort of a part of a census-like, but it was much more than that because it had a fair amount of information on it. And just to give you some idea of all the Ofario properties, this is the earliest type of land grants, at least in the Antilles, I don't know about mainland Spanish America, were these large circular grants. And even though it was something that was for the 17th century, when you look at later records and try to record the properties or get information on the properties, they're still referring to these large circular grants, and some of the maps, because this is derived from a map, historical map showing where the properties were. And so you could see all the Ofarios, and this is just in this part of Cuba, they had other properties, so you can just imagine just how much land that the family owned. So my research question was, as I was telling someone last night at dinner, they were asking me about Cuba, and I said, oh, I guess I didn't seem too excited about it. And I said, well, it's just that it was so difficult doing this project in some ways, and I sometimes felt just so overwhelmed with the logistics that I had to think. I said, well, now I'm not even concerned, or I'm not thinking very much about the project itself. Like, what am I doing here? What is my research question? But I did have some vague ideas for a research question. And the primary thing was, well, what was the purpose of this wall, or what purposes did this wall serve? And I ended up, when I finally got around to writing the monograph, I said, I'm just going to frame this whole study around that. What was the purpose of this wall? And I guess some of you are saying, well, why is that so important? Because it was relatively unheard of, or I hadn't heard of any situations where a slave quarter had been surrounded, not a quarter, but the settlement was surrounded by a wall like that. That was something very new to me. And in fact, when I told colleagues about it, when I returned, they said, oh, you must be mistaken. It can't be a slave settlement. They said they're already enslaved. They didn't have to put a wall around their settlement. And I said, well, yeah, that's true, but doesn't seem to be what happened at this particular plantation. So, I guess the most obvious thing I assumed was that the wall was to contain the people, within the settlement. They didn't want them running away. But then after I read more about just plantations in general and landscape, looking at some of the plantation landscapes in other places, it also served the purpose of sort of putting distance between the slave owner and the enslaved. This was in a very conspicuous way, but I thought I'd look at that line of evidence that would support that. And then also to keep runaways and intruders from entering the slave settlement. I came across one reference in the secondary source when I was first doing this project that suggested that at a certain point there were people actually kidnapping after one of the cholera epidemics or something like that, that there was some effort to steal slaves from one slaveholder and sell them to someone else. I hadn't seen any more evidence that supported that, but at the time I thought, well, let me consider that at least as that, there could be people who would come in and and take some of the enslaved people for whatever reason, including slave runaways, because when they raided a plantation, they often got some recruits to go back with them in the mountains or in the swamps, wherever their runaway settlements were located. So what I then started doing was looking at various records that gave me some ideas as to why you had these, after we started excavations, we were getting lots of post holes. So it seemed pretty obvious that they were detached houses that were within this enclosed wall. And this particular record that talks about how some slaveholders were really irritated with planters who were using, or slaveholders that were using bohíos, just detached houses, for housing enslaved people. because this one says they live and sleep, enslaved people live and sleep in very poorly constructed bohíos. That's the sort of the detached huts that facilitate the entry and exit at hours whenever they crave to go and travel to gatherings, rob, murder, plan conspiracies, and many other disturbances of whatever kind or sort. So so this person who wrote this sent it to the Captain General, and I think the Captain General at that time was also the governor or the head administrator of the colony. So then the first thing then was to be able to check mobility, or at least in terms of the first question, that the wall would help contain them and check slave mobility. And other Cuban slaveholders, like the person who wrote that letter to the Captain General, talked about, were frequently complaining about enslaved people leaving at night, but then apparently coming back. So it wasn't like they were running away, indefinitely. And so some of them then began the practice of locking them up, but this would be in buildings, more of a barrack type situation. So there's no way you could, they didn't lock up each individual detached house, but in a barracks, you could do that. And after a slave rebellion in the area in 1825, then one of the ordinances indicated that at night planters should lock, well, what it said was that if you, and this is a direct reference to having a wall, it said that if you have more than 30, not more than 30, more than 30 enslaved people, that you should have some sort of palisade or something around the slave settlement so that you can lock it up at night. And if you have less than that, then you can just have them in detached housing. And then in 1842, this requirement was established for all enslaved workers, at least in Western Cuba. Again, in the eastern part of Cuba, where, at least the Far East, where they also grew coffee, they didn't seem to have some of these requirements. So there are basically then two forms of housing: the detached housing, which is the image on the top, and then barracks or barracones, for which there are various floor plans that you see listed or illustrated in this slide. This rectangular, or I guess it's sort of square rectangular one, this was called the barracone de patio because the center area was a yard-like area where the enslaved people would cook or have other kinds of activities. But these areas, but the actual places where they live were, around this squared area. So it really does resemble a prison type of situation. That were developing around that period, or even a military barracks or something of that type. So what the wall did, so one possible function of the wall was that you had this way of containing people, but still they would be able to live in thatched dwellings that they built for themselves, and also had places for maybe a few domestic animals and storage of crops. And or at least I think that's what we have here. It was, it's always difficult when you're dealing with post holes, trying to figure out, I mean, if that's all you have, and that was all we had, were all these post holes, and trying to figure out, where the structures are, particularly in the case where they seem so irregular, and it was in some places, in some cases, we really couldn't figure out where the post holes were going. And if I'd done more excavation, maybe I could have, but we felt like we did at least have 3 fully excavated, two fully excavated structures, and then this number 5 possibly went that way. And then this little sort of irregular shaped thing, there's a lot of references to sort of a makeshift type structure that enslaved people, well, not just enslaved people, but even farmers, where they would put various kinds of food crops in, for storage. So it's possible that could have been used for that purpose. And the post holes were dug in the limestone, because this part of Cuba at least is primarily limestone base, and so people just dug. And I've seen this, I actually first saw this in Montserrat, so when I saw it, it was very familiar in terms of that would be the way in which the houses were built, to just dig through the limestone and then put the posts there. And then we did actually find some evidence of a post, some wooden fragments in one of them. Now the barracks type that I showed you earlier, I just wanted to give you a sense of what it would look like, the vertical, what it looks like. But then also, by the mid-19th century, some slaveholders were actually, the entryway, they actually had like a turnstile, like when you go into the train. They actually had something like that rigged up to keep account of who was entering and who was leaving. And so, and some of the, on the very large sugar plantations, and again by the 1850s, there were some slaveholders that had as many as 500 and 600 enslaved people. You had a 2-story barracks, as this one for this Panilla plantation. Also, by 1850, to supplement enslaved people as laborers, you also had the beginning of Chinese indentured laborers working too, and they were housed in these huge barracks as well. They usually had their separate section. There was a separate section for the Chinese, and then Africans in another part, or at least that's how they what the diagram showed. Now, what actually happened with the people once they were there, that might have been, different. And here I'm just showing some ruins, so you can still see in the countryside some ruins of these really huge, they're really huge barracks. But it was expensive to build these, so you're really only talking about the very wealthy who could afford, well, first of all those enslaved people, and secondly, who could afford to build these huge masonry barracks. And then this is just showing another slide of Panelia. I had forgotten I had this, and when I saw it, I said, oh, I think I'll include that in this talk, because again, a lot of people are so amazed that you had this sort of phenomena on plantations, because I think, well, when you think of this plantations in the French or English system, they didn't really, I mean, if they had barracks, there was nothing of this size or, scale. So the other second possibility for the wall would be to create distance, as sort of a way of reducing the slave to a subservient status. And this happened a lot on plantations in various society, using some of Adria Palladio's ideas. One of his ideas was that laborers should be hidden from view, like the private parts of one's body. And this concept was revived in the Neoclassical movement from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s. And coffee plantations in particular in Cuba were considered show places in Western Cuba. It wasn't just a place that produced a cash crop, but also a place that was associated with civility, grace, and prestige. They had beautiful gardens. They were formally laid out using neoclassical plans. Some of the neoclassical design elements you'd find in plantation landscapes, and again, this is just not in Cuba, but in other places as well. The elevated great house, hierarchical order of buildings and structures, symmetrical arrangement of buildings, temple-like great houses, often in a square-shaped floor plan, concealment of slave workers from the formal landscape of the plantation, and then the tree-lined avenues leading up to grand entrances. And so this slide, this is actually a sugar plantation in central Cuba, but this is the great house here. You see it's the highest, it's on the highest point on the plantation. You have this long entryway, tree line to go there. The bohíos are here. It's actually showing in this where the bohíos are, but if you were entering from here, you may not see that because there's sort of a tree barrier concealing that. So many of these ideas you can see, not every plantation is going to have all these elements, or, but you do see again in the mid-19th century this kind of arrangement, landscape plan, just throughout slave societies, throughout slave societies throughout the Americas. And then this is probably the only, or one of the few, I should say, images of a Cuban coffee plantation. This particular one would have been west of Havana, and again, the tree line, the royal palms, again, in Jamaica and in some of the English plantations, you had the same thing, the use of royal palms for the grand entry. And this is probably, you can't see the house very well from here, but this type of double roof house is pretty much a French influence. And a lot of the coffee plantations in Cuba were actually established by the French refugees, or well, I guess maybe they weren't really refugees, but but they, they were fleeing the Haitian Revolution and they resettled in Cuba, and but in the west, the eastern the eastern part of Cuba, the eastern extremity, and then the western part, and so one of the things they did introduce was various architectural styles, and this type of house is one of them. But the quote here is from a coffee planter who was critiquing this sort of elaborate approach to coffee plantations and really criticizing what they symbolize, at least to him. These coffee plantations with their elevated towers, arcs, embankments, gates, and high walls remind me of those feudal palaces cloaked with ceremony and magnificence as to announce the lordship to his vassals, to dazzle, intimidate, and to make very clear to them the huge distance between the humble and calm hut and the imposing and bold palace. So I don't know what his house looked like, but he was criticizing the people who did spend a lot of money on embellishing and their coffee plantations, because, I mean, just from an economic point of view, coffee didn't fare well. I mean, initially, when the coffee plantations began, they were doing quite well, but as Brazil became like the major producer, and they also had competition from other places even before Brazil. And so they were, it had become a losing proposition. So Cuban planters that could afford to also produce sugar, fared okay. But the smaller coffee planter, a lot of them, just abandoned the plantations. And if they were, like a number of Americans actually had coffee plantations, a lot of them just left and went back to the States. So one reason I'm sure of his critique is that, he's really sort of saying, well, can you afford to do this when the market for coffee is just so poor? And then, of course, not all plantations were laid out this way. This particular image actually shows where I've outlined where the slave dwellings are actually above. They're at the highest point of the plantation, which I found interesting. But of course, the terrain of the land is going to determine too how people arrange the buildings on a plantation as well. And this is sort of, this is one version, I don't know if this was the final one or not, of the Reconstruction of Biajacas, the coffee plantation. This walled area is where the slave settlement is, but this is the great house. It's just, it looks very, how should I say, unimpressive but on this. But I mean, it was just a one-story house, but squared shape, very much in that sort of neoclassical plan. But it wasn't, it wasn't a very imposing structure. And then we did find some archaeological evidence of the coffee dryers. And then we had the standing ruins were the ruins of the great house, the wall, and then this structure that, according to the various directories, the various inventories, there are 3 inventories for the plantation, it indicated that that building was probably a hospital, slave hospital, as well as also for some storage. And we didn't find the overseer or manager's house, but it was described as a 2-story building that also functioned. It was also used to store a lot of the coffee. And then this would just be a mill. We really didn't find evidence of that, but it was described in the inventories. And there was one inventory, it was like you could follow the person going through the plantation and recording the size of the buildings and other structures. So the third possibility for the use of the wall was that it kept slave runaways and other intruders out. And this is a quote from Frederica Bremer, who visited Cuba as well as some other places in the Americas. And she says when she was in Cuba that sometimes slave runaways will come in at night, in the nighttime to the plantations for sustenance, which they obtained from the Negroes on the plantation who never betrayed the fugitives. And this quote is important because this seems to be exactly what happened at this plantation, because there is incidents where some enslaved people were on the plantation within the slave area behind the masonry wall. We don't know how long they were there. It's just one very short, brief document that, I'll talk more about it when I get to that point. But the thing is that Biajaca and a lot of plantations were surrounded by caverns and overhangs where it was really easy for slave runaways to hide, and possibly some of the enslaved people at Biajaca did that, because they were listed on the inventory. I think there are 4 people who ran away and they never came back or were able to retrieve them in any way. So this is just showing, and this is like just a few kilometers from plantation. And then I also just wanted to get even a better view of where slave runaways were reported to the colonial authorities. And some of this work had already been done by Gabino La Rosa, who's spent about 30 years studying slave runaways in Cuba. And then I also went to the archives in Matanzas and looked myself as well to see what I could find. And so you can see this is Biajaca's the star, and you see all these runaways that were reported in, on literally three sides of the plantation. And then further south, there was a long-term slave settlement in the swamps in southern Matanzas. So the incident that occurred at the coffee plantation occurred on Christmas Day, and like so many, it seems like Christmas and Holy Week were days that enslaved people either ran away or attempted insurrection. So the overseer, he finds about 20 runaways behind the wall in the slave settlement. And so he runs away. I guess he's outnumbered. So he sneaks out and reports the incident to authorities. But by the time the authorities get there, the runaways had left. And then a group of slave catchers, and as well as the colonial authorities, they go out and they try to find them. They don't appear to have been successful because they didn't capture anybody, but they did see in the caves, where some other runaways had been, but it may have been but he suggested these might have been, I don't think I have that part of the quote here, but he suggested maybe this was an older, from another incident, not people who just left, So who were these runaways that came to Biajaca's? Gabino La Rosa, in his publications, thought that these might have been a group or gang of runaways that were known as El Tambor, the drum. They would actually play the drums at night in the caves, much to the slaveholders' annoyance. So it was like they were taunting them. And then William Van Norman, he wrote a book on, shade-grown slavery. It was about coffee plantations. And he thinks maybe these enslaved people were formerly at a sugar plantation and ran to a coffee plantation where the work is less onerous. I mean, he's like speculating. I mean, that's a possibility. And so what I suggest is that this might not be an isolated case. This is only the one case we've got some written evidence or written description about, because I really think that given where this coffee plantation was located, I would think you'd have that problem periodically. And this happens when, by this time, Ofario is an old man. He's like, when he dies, he died in 1838, and he was like 83. So I'm thinking that he wasn't, by that time, he might have not had much authority, so to speak, or, I guess the overseer would be taking care of the plantation. But I'm thinking that there's always also the possibility that the enslaved people were sort of going and coming as they please, particularly when the overseer might have been involved in something else or just not around. But ultimately, I felt the wall did obstruct some slave activities. It did limit, I think, their access to trade goods unlike I talked about the markets in the English Caribbean and in the southern United States. Well, slave markets weren't really institutionalized in Cuba. A lot of the trade was more illegal, under the table type thing. So, and one of the things that planners complained about was that they would, at night, would be going to local shopkeepers trying to sell and trade. archaeologically, we just didn't find the abundant amounts of household goods and objects. I mean, this might not have anything to do with the fact that they didn't have access, but it could be, I mean, that's one possibility, but it just could be that they were using more perishable materials. Also, the fact that the slave population was 2/3 male at this plantation, I still haven't been able to figure out if that might have been a factor. I mean, it's so hard to gender archaeology or make these kinds of gendered interpretations from archaeology. And I guess, yeah, so those are some of the things that might have obstructed slave activities as a result of the wall. And there is evidence that they did use perishable materials. For example, Bramer talks about the use of acacia, red berries for making necklaces. We know that they use gourds for a number of things, serving, for food consumption, but also to make musical instruments, like this particular one. And they did actually do some trading. Another traveler visited a coffee plantation, actually one of the largest, and that particular slaveholder had a store or would sell things to the enslaved people on the plantation. And he just said that the enslaved people buy crockery, beads, and cooking pots. And so those are the sorts of things. These are all items we recovered from the slave quarters. So the next thing is, well, how did the enslaved people respond to living in the enclosure? And I felt like they did create their own sense of space. They built the houses for themselves. They ate communally with other enslaved people. There's evidence of them making these gaming pieces. And from what we know, most of these gaming pieces were used in sort of like gambling, games of chance, gambling, that kind of thing. They also seem to have imbibed in some alcoholic beverages. On some plantations, the slaveholders would actually provide small amounts of alcohol to enslaved people, and on others it was strictly forbidden. And then one thing which people have criticized me a lot for this interpretation, I mean, I just was amazed that there were so many machetes coming from the slave houses. And I just thought that was odd that you would have a fence, that have this big masonry wall trying to contain people, and then you let them have machetes, in there. I mean, I realize a machete can be used for all sorts of things, and it's a primary agricultural tool in the tropics. But at the same time, a lot of the slave revolts, like the one in 1825 that I mentioned, that the machete was what they, killed all the slaveholders. I mean, because I think 14 whites perished in that revolt. So it just seems like it would be the kind of thing you would try to control their access. And actually on some plantations in other places, that's exactly what they did. They wouldn't allow them to have machetes, in their houses. They had to report at the end, like particularly after harvesting sugar, they had to leave it at the, with the overseer, and then it would be locked in storage till the next day. So my conclusions there are contributions of the study. Moreno Fernales, he advanced the idea of Cuban slavery being jailed-like in the 19th century. And then Gloria Garcia in 2003 felt that this jail-like image existed, but it was a planner ideal. It wasn't something that all planners were able to implement, you know, for a lot of reasons. You know, like I said, the expense of building these masonry buildings, you know, maybe the terrain didn't permit having the ideal neoclassical plans so you could have good surveillance. So there are a lot of, it might have been something a lot of planners aspired to, but only a very few were able to implement. And what I've found from both the archaeology and the documentary sources for Biajacas was that life was constricted, but the enslaved really pushed the boundaries of their containment. And that Biajacas was part of a carceral landscape, you know, consisting of buildings, walls, and designated paths that restricted their activities to certain areas. But in spite of that, they were, like I said, they were able to push the boundaries and you know, get as much do as much to their advantage as possible. So thank you, and